Hello, everybody, and welcome to the next installment of the new conversation series celebrating 25 years of the Men's Development Network. Today, as our guest is a man I have had the good fortune to hear speak and to break bread with on his recent visit to Ireland on the invitation of Women's Aid Ireland. Our guest is Jackson Katz. He is an American educator, filmmaker, and author. The Macho Paradox being one of his publications. He has created a gender violence prevention education program entitled Mentors in Violence Prevention, and which is a program that has been used across the military areas of the United States. He's a graduate of a number of universities, including Massachusetts and Harvard and UCLA, where he did his doctorate. And I suppose he has the unique distinction of being the first man to have sat in on a women's studies program in Massachusetts, which is fantastic. His other roles involve being an overseer of the Real Man program, which is a grassroots organization around sexism in Boston. But primarily his work has been as a founder in relation to violence, the Mentors in Violence program, and running it within the kind of the sports element of universities across Ireland, across the United States, and also including with professional teams such as the Patriots and the Boston Red Sox. I think currently he's a paid consultant with the US Air Force, around the bystander intervention training program, and also acts as the director of the first global gender violence prevention program in the US Marine Corps. I think fundamentally, and I would see this, and he can correct me when he gets a chance, I would see him as an advocate and an activist in terms of engaging and mobilizing men's involvement in ending men's violence against women. So welcome, Jackson. Delighted to have you here. As I said, we had a really good fortune to kind of meet up for each other. Well, I had the good fortune to meet you a couple of weeks back when you were here in Ireland, and so it's a wonderful opportunity for us to have a conversation in relation to your work and what brought you about into that work, and how you got there. So, but what I'd like to start with, if it's okay, Jackson, and that is, sometimes I think it's useful to kind of get a sense of who the person is and their life experience, and I know I've seen that from your college work, whatever it may be, but I'm intrigued about anybody who's grown up in a place called Swampscott. It's a very interesting name and a place. But what was it like growing up there and your life around that area and those times and with your family?
Well, first, thanks, Seán, for inviting me to be part of your series, and it's good to work with you, and it's good to see you in virtual space. We just saw each other back, I don't know, a month ago in Ireland. So thanks for following up. And I know that the Men's Development Network has been doing like really important and interesting and critically important work for a long time now, 25 years. I appreciate that. And so thanks for, like I said, allowing me to be part of your work for this moment. I was born in Boston. So what you say, Swampscott, is a town just 15, 17 miles north of Boston. So I spent much of my childhood growing up in that small town. I would describe it as a small town suburban jockocracy. And meaning that sports was really a central feature of my hometown, and Swampscott, although small, was a prominent American football town. We won the first state championship back when they started creating state championships. My town won the first state championship. This is a few years before my time, but I grew up in that culture, and I happened to be a really good American football player, and I played other sports as well, basketball. Track, but I was a really, pretty accomplished high school, American football player. And so I was in that sort of jock and sports culture. And when I went to university as a young guy, 18 years old, I thought I was well educated, relatively speaking, as a high school graduate, but I realized very quickly in university how little I actually knew about the world, and much of what I learned in the first year of my university education was was about gender and race and sexual orientation issues that were, while they were swirling about in my head in other ways, I hadn't really thoughtfully engaged with the topics much at all. And I, without going into great detail, because there's so much more than I could possibly communicate here, I was ready as a young guy to move away from the traditional football culture. Even though I had done well in it, I knew that there were problems with it, and I didn't feel particularly at ease with the difference between my emotional and relational sort of life and desires, if you will, and then the role that I was playing in a public sense in the sports culture. And and again, I have to say I had some privileges, so I'm not saying that I didn't get something positive from it. But I did come from, by the way, a working class background. While I was on my track to university, I did come from a working class family, so it wasn't like I was born into privilege in that way. But I did have some advantages. And so anyways, when I was taking I started taking courses in my first year of university that had gender in the topic description or the title of the course. And I wasn't articulate about this at that time, but I knew there was something that I wanted to explore about this unease that I was feeling between the public persona that I was engaged in, if you will, and performing, and then the private complex reality of my doubts, fears, anxieties, family problems, any number of things. And so when I started reading feminist literature and hearing from women and hearing women's lives narrated both in fiction, but also in real life, people talking about the complex experiences, I started realizing, oh my God, feminism is not like anti-male. It's actually giving me insight into my own life in a way that I had never experienced before. And I realized very quickly as a young man that these ideas, what's called feminist ideas, but it's understanding how gender is one of the central axes around which human societies are organized. That has enormous implications, not just for women, but also for men. And I got that very, very early as like an 18-year-old guy, and then as a 19-year-old guy. And I started like absorbing all this stuff and thinking, oh my God, this is really unbelievably interesting intellectually and personally. And then I looked around, it was like mostly women engaged with this conversation. It was very few men. In fact, as you referenced, I was the first man to, I ended up getting what's called a minor in women's studies back in, the early 80s. So I was the first man, but at my university, and one of the first in the United States. But again, it wasn't out of altruistic concern for what men were doing to women or women's experience, although that was part of it. It was also self-interest. It was like, I'm learning about not only myself and my own, challenges, but I'm learning about all the men around me. I grew up in a culture where there was all kinds of men with all kinds of problems, emotional problems, relational problems, violence problems. And this was giving me an insight. All these ideas were giving me an insight into it's all connected. So in other words, women's, desire to be treated as full human beings and to break free of thousands of years of sort of patriarchal second-class citizenship is also connected to men's struggle to be better human beings and to be more fully connected emotionally, relationally, and everything else. It was never to me one or the other. It was always both part of the package. But I also, and I'll wrap up here, but for this moment, but I also realized very early on that there were very few men doing this work, and that if I wanted the work to be done, I needed to do it myself, kind of thing. And it wasn't that there was no men doing it, but I'm telling you, back in the late 1970s, early 1980s, it was few and far between to find men, and I had none in my immediate universe. But then I began to see things. And for example, I'll give you one example. I had a guy come to my university as a guest speaker. His name was Don Sabo. He was a sociologist. In fact, he was one of the founding academics or intellectuals of the men's health movement. Don Sabo was way ahead of the curve, but he was also one of the founding sociologists who developed sports sociology. And Don was a former university football player in the States. We have university athletics, a big operation here. And he was a football player, and I went to go see him speak at the University of Massachusetts. And I remember it was the first time I had seen a man who came from anything like my background, which is to say sports centric and, traditional male background, who was engaging fully with these ideas. And I talked to him afterwards, and we're still friends to this day, 40, plus years later. But it was important to me to see that there were other men who were actually engaged with this, including men who had my background. And but that was back in the day when like I said, when most of my mentors, both intellectually and personally and politically, were women, and women across the racial and ethnic spectrum. So women of color, white women. And anyways, so what I did when I started gaining all this sort of insight is I started becoming an activist, and I started writing. I wrote for the school newspaper. I used to write a weekly column starting in my sophomore, second year of university. I had a weekly column in the daily newspaper, student newspaper, and I was writing about this and other subjects. And I started student organizations. I started becoming a very, sort of high-profile activist. And one of my main goals was, how do we get men more involved in this conversation and the broader feminist conversation that include men's violence against women? And not only, it was also about, sexual freedom and, and opposing the rightward move of the United States with the election of Ronald Reagan, where Reagan's presidency, in many ways, his election in 1980 was in many ways a rejection of all the forward progress that the United States had been making since the 1960s on gender equality and racial justice and heterosexual sort of, heterosexism and the anti-war movements. Reagan represented a backlash against all that forward progress.
And it's now happening again.
It's now happening again. Exactly. For example, "Make America Great Again," Donald Trump's slogan, was Ronald Reagan's slogan. So Donald Trump borrowed that slogan from Ronald Reagan. Yeah. So anytime there's forward progress, there's going to be pushback and backlash. And I happen to be coming of age right at a time when all the positive forward motion from the 60s and 70s was going backwards. And so I was an impassioned activist. And I honestly do today in my, I'm in my early 60s. I'm doing today what I started doing as a 19-year-old university student. I might, I have more books today, and I have nicer clothing, but I have a lot shorter hair, not by choice, but I'm doing the same thing that I started as a 19-year-old.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. You said something at the start that you were ready, you were open. And I think that's it's quite a profound statement to be saying at 18 and 19. And I'm just wondering, did to be open and ready for this conversation, it didn't happen by chance. There was your own, your life experience that you had when you were growing up, your relationship with your family, your father and mother and your brothers and sisters and other people around you had created that kind of fertile environment for you to be open. Would that be fair as well at that time?
I would say that it created the conditions that allowed me to respond to. So it wasn't so much. Yes, it's true that there was something about my experience, as we all have experiences in childhood and in adolescence. There's so many pieces to this. I'll try to think of how to be concise, Sean, because I could go on. Just so we could all go on. You could talk about your own, the complexities of childhood and experiences and family. I'll give you a couple of headlines if you don't mind. Please. My father, my biological father, I never met. He died when my mother was pregnant with me. He was 37 years old and died of a heart attack. And he was a World War II veteran of the United States Army, served in France and Germany from 1943 to 1946. And he was a medic, and he was a non-commissioned officer in charge of a medical unit. And so I'm assuming that my father saw a lot of, trauma. Yeah. And maybe experienced trauma. I don't know, because he had never met him, and he didn't talk about it when he came back to to my mother or other family members, which is so common among men of that generation or even other generations. So who knows? And my mother remarried when I was young to a man who was also a World War II veteran, in the United States Army. Served in France, Belgium, Germany, and he was I'm sorry to say he was a sad case. His father, who was a really prominent athlete and coach, and a World War I and World War II veteran. That's my step grandfather, who was in a public sense, he was a very successful guy, but privately he was a very, he was abusive, and to his family members. And my stepfather carried a lot of that trauma. And so I grew up with, dysfunctional men right in my immediate family. And, but because again, I figured out a way to channel my rage and anger and frustration through sports in a way that I got socially validated by. When I later in my 20s started working in a detention center with young men in the Boston area, in a juvenile detention center with young men, I started realizing, oh my God, if my life had gone a little bit differently, or if a few factors had been somewhat different, maybe I could have been one of those kids. Sure. Because a lot of those kids are filled with rage, anger, frustration, and they're inarticulate about it, many of them, and many of them do really stupid things and sometimes really harmful things to other people and to themselves, because they don't know what they're doing really. I mean, their emotional life is so unregulated, and they have no sort of they don't understand that there's a better way to channel what they're feeling. Anyways, I could connect to that in a way, but I think I early on figured out a way to do it in a way that was in a positive way that got me social approval rather than locked up in prison. You know what I mean?
I think they are those sliding door moments, in people's lives around stuff. And it may have been even a very positive intervention with a coach around your football team and things like that. I also have those really kind of important things. And I like my own experience of, like, I worked in the juvenile detention center for many years, about maybe 8 years. I always say I got the longest sentence than any of the children got. But so you do, and I was relatively young when I was there, and so I could, like, the odd time I'd see a chap, on the street, and very rarely have they come out of the chaos, in terms of where they're at. So I look at it and say, there go I, but for the grace of God, or wherever it may be, whatever kind of is out there, and where you go with it, So like, I think that it's a good space in terms of where, as you say, about being open and ready, like that. I think it's a fine to be sitting into a college, and I didn't go to college until I was 28. I was an immature student. I used to call myself, as opposed to a mature student. So I was going in a very, very different way. But going in as a 19-year-old and being ready and being open and to learn and to absorb it all. It's like, I suppose I was thinking I was going to ask you about a kind of the light bulb moment, but this is no light bulb moment. It was all happening. It was nearly a effervescent space, like an explosion of stuff happening, as opposed to a light bulb moment for you.
That's good. That's well said. It's true. I was one of these young people who, when I really, my eyes really began to open. I mean, again, I wasn't completely oblivious in high school, but not when it comes to these issues and racism and stuff like that. I was not at all enlightened until I got to the place of university. But I was one of these people who, young people who wanted to change the world. You know what I mean? Like, I looked around and I'm like, this is so obviously wrong. There's so many these systems that, whether it's men's violence or war or racism, it's so obviously wrong. It's so obviously inconsistent with the values we claim to believe in, many of us, of justice and fairness and equality and all those platitudes that a lot of people in, Western societies, say they subscribe to. And it was so obvious to me the disjunction between those stated values and what was really happening in the way that institutional practices worked and the way that certain social conventions were playing out right in front of me. And I was like, we got to change this. And so I became a passionate activist. And I'm to this day, I feel like I'm an activist. I call myself a scholar activist, an educator activist. But this isn't about sitting in a room. I mean, I am sitting in a room with, books, and I read constantly, and I'm writing and engaged intellectually, and I will be to the day that I, drop, but it also means going out and engaging with the world and trying to change those systems and use the knowledge and use the information and use the analysis that I've gained and through my own studies and through everybody else's, to try to, how do you change these systems, and how do you create healthier systems? And knowledge is power. To the extent that you know more and that you understand more, both emotionally but also intellectually, and how systems work and how individual lives are affected by how systems are, producing these, because individuals aren't just individuals. They're individuals who are products of systems. And so it's all, to me, it's all like, it all works hand in glove. And the famous, feminist slogan, the personal is political, it's true for men and it is for women. Yeah. And it's true for everybody, not just men and women, everybody. But the personal is political. So the way that you live in the world is constrained in many ways by the systems that surround you, whether it's family systems and political systems, economics, structures. All of this affects who you are and your life chances. And I got all this. I was, again, fortunate to get all this early. And then try to put it into practice. Like, what do I do with all this stuff? And I have to say, in those early stages, especially when I graduated from university, I was like, what am I going to, I graduated, moved to Boston. What am I going to do now in the big city, if you will, to like make the changes that I clearly could see needed to be made? And especially, how do we get more men? My whole passion was, starting in university and continuing to this day, how do we get more men who have the courage and the strength and the self-confidence to be introspective, to think inwardly about our own self and about men, and not be so defensive and like somehow women are attacking us, feminists are attacking us. This is so simple-minded. And I got that when I was like 19, that men who retreated in a defensive crouch and said, feminists just hate men, they're just attacking men. I thought from the age of 19, I thought that was simple-minded, and I still to this day think it's simple-minded. And as I said earlier, I mean, men's health has been my personal concern since I was 19. My personal health, but also men's health. And I have to say, Seán, just to make sure I don't forget saying this in this interview, the men's health movement, which is small but growing around the world, really, which is a way of understanding how men's emotional, physical, psychological, and sexual health are affected dramatically by cultural beliefs about quote unquote manhood that have direct implications for men's self-care or lack of self-care, the fact of men not taking care of themselves or allowing themselves to deteriorate both physically and emotionally because they don't want to ask for help and things like that. All these ways in which men's health is affected by gender in terms of especially masculinity, and this cuts across class, race, ethnicity, and geography. The men's health movement is directly an outgrowth of the feminist-led women's health movement, which started in the early 1970s. In fact, Boston, my home city, was the city one of the so that gave birth, if you will, to the women's health movement. It was the Boston Women's Health Book Collective collectively wrote a book called Our Bodies, Ourselves, and it was about women's health from a feminist perspective back in the early 70s. Most of the major figures in the men's health movement over the past 40 plus years explicitly credit the feminist-led women's health movement with giving them the insight to think about men's health in an extraordinarily, connected way. And yet you still hear to this day, whether it's men's rights activists or others, saying feminists hate men. What about men's health? What about all the things that men suffer? Suicide, depression. It's like, feminists were talking about that decades before you even were born in some cases. And so the idea that somehow it's incompatible, feminism is incompatible with thinking about men's health is just ignorance. It's just not true. It's inaccurate. And so I'm saying that emphatically because I think it's important for men to hear, especially if you want to improve men's health, if you want to improve boys' health, then listen to what these women are saying and some of these men and not see them as our antagonists. They're not.
And I think that it's a critical thing around our work here in Ireland in terms of the development of the Men's Development Network was very much around that non-adversarial approach. As an organisation, just to give you a bit of background, we were involved in the development of the first ever Irish men's health policy in Ireland. And of course, the Irish men's health policy was the first ever men's health policy in the world. You know, so we were there, and our role in that as an organization was very much around kind of softening the medical model approach and bringing a social determinants approach to health. That was our critical influence in terms of the work, and which was really, really important around that. And it does bring us back to what you're saying about, and I've always loved when I hear you talk, Jackson, about and how you talk about women and their involvement, and how we need to acknowledge the work that they've done in the past, you know, and embrace it, you know, because it's needed to be embraced, like, you know. And so, like, it was something that it was a question that I was going to talk to you about in terms of acknowledging that, and also your other question that you, or the other statement that you say sometimes, is very much around like this, like in terms of violence against women, it's a men's issue, and it's done in a way, I have to say, that I don't like. Sometimes I get a set, people say things and I back away a bit, because I'm thinking, oh, that could prevent a backlash. That could get that statement. Listen, it's not all men. It's this, that, Reverend, maybe, and all that type of stuff. They're gonna go, whoa, back up. But you always do it in such a way that I don't get that. And I was gonna ask you a question, like, has that taken years to craft your language around that? Because I think it's something that it is really nuanced on it.
No, it's a good. I appreciate that question and insight. Let me say, when I started the Mentors in Violence Prevention program, this is 1993, and that was the first large-scale sexual assault and domestic abuse prevention program in university athletics, and then in professional athletics in North America. And then it became the first program in the United States military, starting in 1997 in the United States Marine Corps. And it's gone from there. And that was, by the way, the MVP program, you mentioned it at the beginning, but the MVP program is the program that introduced the bystander approach to the whole field of domestic and sexual violence prevention. And, you know, I was the creator of the program. But anyhow, my thinking in working in the sports culture was, initially, it was strategic, right? It was not that there was a problem in athletics of male athletes assaulting women, although there was such a problem, and there continues to be such a problem. My thinking was, where are we going to find more men, in particular young men, who have the courage and the strength to stand up and speak out on these matters? Because I was convinced early on that there's an awful lot of men who don't like the status quo. In other words, they look around and they think there's a lot of, you know, bad behavior going on, you know, men assaulting women, and in particular, and men assaulting other men, you know. But certainly men assaulting women, and yet they don't speak up. And I know the reason why they don't speak up, because they're afraid of other men, and they're afraid of the disapproval of other men, and they're worried, many men are, they're worried that if they do stand with women, or they do take a stance and challenge and interrupt other men's abuse, they'll be seen as somehow a traitor to the gender, or not a real man, or they're soft, or they're being politically correct, or they're virtue signaling, and they don't really mean it. They're just trying to look good. And there's all this cynicism that attaches, and also with this notion of somehow disloyalty, like somehow they're being disloyalty to their brothers, which is total BS. And it's one of the ways that a lot of men and young men police each other into conformist silence, which allows the system of abuse to continue. And the abuse hurts women, but it also hurts men. And for example, I talk about all the boys who grew up in homes with domestic violence, where their father, domestic, you know, abuse, where their father, their mother's boyfriend, is abusive to their mother, and then traumatizes the kids. And the kids, in the category of kids, the kids who are growing up traumatized, whether it's in Ireland, the United States, or anywhere, that category of children includes not just girl children, but boys. And look at all the boys in the juvenile system, for example, in Ireland, in Europe, in the United States. Many of them end up in jail and then in adult prison. But look at all those boys whose life started out as traumatized boys in situations where they experienced violence, either immediately and directly, or as trauma, you know, survivors from being traumatized by by a man assaulting their mother. And sometimes the mother is abusive, and I understand that, and mothers can be abusive. But you know, the majority of time, it's the father, it's the man. In a heterosexual context, it's the man who is the primary abuser. And anyways, it's an act of compassion with boys and young men to say we need to figure out what's going on here and how do we change it. Anyways, you were asking about the language and the framing. So by working with athletes, I was trying to seek credibility beyond the athletic subculture. The idea was, if we can say we're the program that works with these football players, these rugby players, right? Yes, tough guys.
Yeah.
And they're not going to be able to say to us, men outside that subculture aren't going to be able to say, what kind of wimpy program is this? You guys aren't real men. And I was like, okay, we can cut right through that BS and that policing, the silencing that goes on, the policing that goes on, and really talk honestly about what's really happening. That's why it was intentional. And then moving into the military was similarly strategic, even though it happened in a certain way that it fell into line in a certain way, but it was a strategic plan of mine, because my goal was, if you get the sports culture and the military culture on board, then you can go anywhere. And you can go into corporate boardrooms, you can go into blue collar factories, you can go into, with young people, is anywhere, because you can say, look, we're working with these men who are, many of them have enormous success in traditional, masculine world. And they also say that there's real problems that have to be addressed. And there's a lot of problems in those subcultures. And the courageous men in those subcultures will acknowledge this. And look, they're working on it, so you can work on it too. And I think, yes, I was ahead of the curve in thinking through some of this stuff and the messaging, but it's gotten, I've gotten better at it over the years, obviously. Because the more you do it, the more you understand how people respond. And even saying what I've just said, Sean, when I go into a room and give a speech, I'll say right out loud that I know that there are some men who are listening to this or hearing this who, no matter what I say, are still going to feel defensive, are going to still walk out of there and say, you know what, yeah, that was just another male bashing session. And my perspective is, we just carry on. We just keep calm and carry on, as the British military says. It's like you just got to keep doing your work, because some people aren't ready for whatever reason. They're so defended, they're so hostile, they're so angry, and you're not going to change everybody overnight. You just got to keep doing your work. Can I say one other thing before I start? Growing up in Boston, I knew a ton of Irish people and Irish Americans. And Boston is arguably the most Irish of American cities. And so when I work with Ireland, like I'm having this conversation, I'm assuming a lot of people listening are going to be Irish. I mean, like, if you look at the kids that I grew up with, my friends and peers and teammates, it's just like O'Brien and Dunleavy and, McGillicuddy, and I mean, on and on and on. The Irish have such a footprint in Boston. And so, working with the country, the home country, if you will, people like yourself, it has a special resonance for me. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, no, it's great. I think, and listen, when you look at kind of the representation of Irish in Boston, like, it's been very, very significant, but it has a lot of that macho-ness attached to it as well. It just really, it's quite unusual. I suppose one of the key things I want to ask you today, and I know this is a really difficult question probably to answer, Jackson, so apologies on it in the first instance, but it's more around saying, to give a brief snapshot of what the bystander and the MVB programs are. Now, I know you could talk for, forever on these things, but like, just a quick stuff for some of the people who've tuned in now today, they may not know. They might have listened to our conversation, they've tuned in, but they don't know what a bystander is or what the MVP program might be. So if kind of a brief snapshot of it to give us people a sense of it, what it is and how it tries to engage, and the other word you like to use, which is to mobilize men into agents of social change, really. That's right.
Sure. So, and I appreciate that. Yes, it's much bigger than this. So I'll try to give the most concise description as I can, because the bystander approach has lots of spin-off, both conceptually and practically applications. So the bystander approach is a way of thinking about how to prevent violence, harassment, or abuse, not by focusing on the perpetrator or the person doing it, or the victim or the target or the person experiencing it, but but by focusing on everybody else in the peer culture, whether it's in a workplace, in a school, or on a team, in a community. And what we did in the early 90s when I started the MVP program was we were focused. I mean, we were, I'm sorry, can I shut my window? I don't know if you can hear this. Okay, okay. There's a buzzsaw going. I mean, it's not compatible.
I can't hear it. I may add, you may be hearing it, but I can't.
Okay,
even better.
That's encouraging. Okay, but so when I started the MVP program, the question was, what was I and we, what were we going to do to invite men into the conversation rather than indict them as potential rapists and abusers? And I say invite rather than indict, which is a quote from Esther Solar, the founder of an organization called Futures Without Violence in San Francisco. Because I say that because back in the 1970s and the 1980s, most of what was called prevention approaches to sexual and domestic abuse focused not on men, they focused on women. And that what they taught women was how to avoid situations of potential risk. Don't put your drink down at a party because a guy could drop a rape drug in your drink. Look in the back seat of your car before you get in. You know, have a buddy system. If you're going to be drinking alcohol, make sure you know who your friends are with and who they're going home with. And to this day, women and girls are taught this in urban areas and suburban and rural areas, a mental checklist of every day what they have to do to reduce their risk. But that's not prevention. It's risk reduction. And there's an important distinction, because prevention means going to the root cause of the problem. And women and girls aren't assaulting themselves. And when men were focused on back in those days, in the 70s and 80s, it was almost always as perpetrators or potential perps. So the spirit of the educational message to men was, you better know the law in Ireland or the United States, what have you, about sexual consent. And if you're with somebody sexually and pushing forward and you're not sure if they're fully on board, you need to back off because you could be crossing the line into committing sexual assault. The problem with focusing on men and young men that way is most men disidentify with that. They don't see themselves as abusive. They don't see themselves as assaultive. And so they sometimes men resent it, and sometimes they're even hostile. Like, why are you talking to me like this? I'm a good man. I'm a good person, you know? And like you said, not all men, you know, anyhow, I knew all this. Like, I know that's how a lot of men react. So I was like, okay, how do we move beyond this? And because we were funded by the United States Department of Education to create a model program working with university male athletes, it was like, okay, what are we going to do that breaks the mold? And I had a professor in graduate school who, along with his colleagues, was looking at an approach to bullying prevention among 13 and 14-year-olds. And what they were doing was really cutting edge, because they weren't focusing on the kid doing the bullying or the kid experiencing it, but everybody else. And I thought, okay, what about connecting that approach to the issue of domestic and sexual abuse and violence? That way we can say to men, look, if you're not abusive yourself, to women in this case, that's good, but it's not good enough. What are you doing to make it clear to the guys around you that you don't accept their acting out in some abusive ways, and not just physically or sexually violent ways, but even making, you know, sexist or degrading comments about women? What are you going to do if you're a guy and you're sitting in a room full of guys hanging out or whatever you're doing, and one of the two of the guys start really talking smack in really negative ways about girls or women? If you don't say something to make it clear that you're not okay with that, in a sense, isn't your silence a form of consent and complicity in their sexism? And don't we know that sexism or, you know, misogyny or hatred of women is not just confined to individual acts at the tip of this pyramid? They're not just like it. There's a whole cultural belief system that underlies that. And if you don't participate actively in changing the foundation, if you look at a triangle here, the tip of the triangle is a pyramid where there's an incident, but the base of the pyramid is a set of attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors that help to create the foundation for that incident of sexual assault or domestic violence. And the same with racism. Racism is not just an individual act of, you know, of hurting a white person hurting a person of color or something. It's a belief system. It's structures, economic, political structures, and same with sexism. Anyways, so we were trying to figure out, okay, what we're going to say to these young men is we need you to be part of the solution by making it clear to the men around you that treating women and girls like that, or other men and boys, and then beyond the binary, it's just not okay. Not because it's illegal and you're going to get in trouble with the authority figures, like whether it's a teacher, a principal in a school setting, or the police, or some authority figure in the public realm, but because the peer culture was going to police itself. The kids, the young people, the older people, whatever it was, are going to make it clear that that's just not how we do things in this group, in this team, in this workplace, in this community. And I'm a member of this community, and I'm going to speak up and say, that's not cool. Mm-hmm. That's the bystander approach in a nutshell. And we started out only working with men. It became clear very quickly that people who we were working with wanted us to work with women as well, because they were thinking, what about the women? What role can they play? And women both as potential abusers, but also as victims and survivors, but of course, as friends and teammates and classmates and colleagues and coworkers. So now the bystander approach, that was the MVP was the first program, Mentors in Violence Prevention, to introduce this approach to the field. And now everybody in the domestic and sexual violence field in North America and increasingly in Europe is engaging with this bystander approach. Some people, I have to say, the way that they practice it, don't do it in what I consider a transformative fashion. Because what they do is what they do it like is what I refer to as like glorified nightclub bouncer training. Okay. So you're training someone to jump in. You're at a party and you see an incident happening. You need to not wait for the authorities to come. You need to jump in yourself. I don't think we need more nightclub bouncers. I think what we need is honest discussions about the underlying belief systems about masculinity is, manhood, womanhood, gender more broadly. And I think young men in particular and older men in particular need the opportunity to sit and talk with each other as well as with women and others about what does it mean to be a man, and how are my behaviors reflective of this belief system, and what does it mean to be a strong man, and how do you define strength? And isn't the person who speaks up in the face of injustice, isn't that an act of strength? And how do we define strength beyond physical strength and courage beyond physical courage? Because I think a lot of men, myself included, want to be courageous and want to see ourselves as courageous. But courage is not just physical courage, jumping into gunfire or storming the beaches, which I appreciate and respect physical courage. But there's other kinds of courage. There's moral courage. There's social courage. There's the courage to say to your friend who's treating his girlfriend badly, he's verbally abusing her on the phone, is taking him aside and saying, dude, the way you're talking to your girlfriend, I'm concerned with you, about you and her. And that's courageous and that's strong. And so if we say it like that to men, I think you're much more likely to get a positive response than to wag your finger at them and tell them that they're bad. Yeah. Which is another reason why I don't even use the word toxic masculinity. I don't think it's a good word. And I think it's a shutdown word. I think a lot of men hear it and they just they hate men, or this is against me as a human being, and I'm not going to even listen to what they're saying.
Yeah, and I think just on that, Jackson, like I was just going to say, do you think in terms of the general narrative around domestic and sexual violence allows men to become defensive and step back out of the conflict and not engage and not become active? Yeah, I mean, that's not. I'm not trying to condone it or excuse it. I'm just, but like sometimes the narrative is really finger pointing and it's not inviting. It's demanding of something. And that's that. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it gets tricky. The politics of this are complicated because the women who are the driving force behind the development of the domestic abuse movement and the sexual assault movements, they've done incredible transformative work. But many of them, understandably, are angry and frustrated at men, and both individual men and men as a whole, male-dominated cultures that have been so horrible to so many women and children and other men, but certainly if you want to center women and women's experience, and they're understandably angry about it. It's like people of color who are understandably angry about racism. I mean, look at the response to the Queen Elizabeth's passing. And I happen to be in the UK when Queen Elizabeth died, and I actually went into the throngs of people at Buckingham Palace the night after she died, and because I was like a tourist, here I am in this country when this happened. It's a world historical spectacle, and I'm interested, and I wanted to be, observing and seeing. But, there's all this love and all this, outpouring of grief for, Queen Elizabeth. But then you have this other narrative about colonized peoples, whether it's the Irish or the dark-skinned peoples in South Asia or Africa. The British Empire, has a huge footprint and had a huge footprint. And a lot of people don't feel fondly about that.
Sure.
And who can blame them? And at the same time, you have to hold these two things at the same time. Queen Elizabeth was a great figure and is beloved by billions of people, including, by the way, people of color who saw the positive and the negative at the same time. And I do think that that's true in the domestic and sexual violence movement. A lot of these women are angry at men and frustrated with men, but they're also, many of them, extraordinarily compassionate and wanting to work with men. But I think they need men to step up, and they need men to take some risks, and they don't need to coddle men. And I think a lot of men want to be coddled in a sense. They want to be treated with care. And I think some of those women are like, you deal with it. We have enough to deal with on our own, which is one of the reasons why the Men's Development Network is so important, why the men who do this work in the United States and all over the world, it's so important, because we need men doing this work, right? It's not fair to put it on the shoulders of women. Sure. And I think men like myself, and I'm sure yourself and your colleagues, we're in a position as men to learn from and have learned from what these women are saying. But because we're men, we can translate it in a way, I think, if we're effective, and some of us are and some of us are less so, but if we're effective, we can translate it in a way that men can hear. And if they're hearing it from other men, they're hearing it slightly differently than they would be hearing the same or similar thing from women. Just like, again, with racism, I always use the analogy because race is so fraught, especially in the States, but not exclusively, obviously. But I think, people of color, African Americans in particular, have been the driving force behind the civil rights movement and all these transformations that have been happening for the past 60 plus years, 70 years in the United States, and then globally. They're the driving force, but there are lots of white people who have engaged in the Black Lives Matter, for example, movement, the largest outpouring of social protest in the history of the United States, 2020, because of the George Floyd murder. But there were millions of white people out in the streets. It wasn't just black people or people of color across the spectrum. It was a lot of white people. Well, I think this is similarly with gender issues. It's like women are the driving force, but there needs to be men out there, not just out in the streets, but doing the work and organizing and speaking, like even having conversations like this, because men and young men need to hear men engaging with this subject. Yeah. And at the same time, I greatly admire and respect the women who have been and continue to be at the forefront, but I don't think it's fair to put the burden of working, quote unquote, working with men on their shoulders. They have enough to handle already.
Yeah, no, I tell you, I'd fully endorse and go with that in terms of the reason why we're in the work, and I think it's something that we feel that we bring a different perspective into the work, Jackson, in terms of different, not better, but just different in terms of engaging men and boys, allowing them to sit into the rooms in what they feel are safe environments, not to be judged, not to be kind of coming in from a position of shame, so there's lots of different things around that work, and whether we're working with perpetrators or whether we're working with young men to try and get them activated or older men to get them involved in, like, I have to say, one of the hardest things I've ever had to do is to go fundraise for Men Ending Violence Against Women program. You know what I mean? Like, you fellas looking at you going, what? Do you not know about this? So it's a very, very difficult kind of environment, So, but just, I suppose there's a question I have. It's a kind of, I suppose it's a cheeky enough question, really, in some senses, Jackson. But I was just saying, like, if the patriarchal system and structures that are in existence today, and if they had determined that sexual and domestic violence was a man's issue, where would we be better off now? Would there be a reduction, do you think? Where would we think we'd be at that stage?
We'd have radically and dramatically less domestic abuse and sexual harassment and sexual assault and sexual abuse of children. It would be radical and dramatic, the reduction, if it would prioritized by male-dominated institutions whether they're cultural institutions, political institutions, educational, sports, across the board. If it was seen as a men's issue, if it was seen as men's responsibility to deal with this, we'd have a tiny fraction of the abuse. Obviously, there's going to be individuals with sociopathology or psychopathology from deep trauma and other experiences that are not going to be susceptible to education or social norms change or what have you. But that's a very small fraction of the abuse that actually goes on. Most men who commit abusive behavior don't see themselves in any way as, you know, crazy or they're not mentally ill. They don't even see themselves as in many cases as doing something wrong. They think it's legitimate what they're doing. I mean, on university campuses in the States, and I'm sure this is true in Ireland, and I'm sure it's true all over the place, the vast majority of men who commit rape, literally whose actions meet the legal definition of rape, the vast majority do not in any way see themselves as rapists. They don't think what they've done is wrong. They think that they might think they're sexually aggressive in some way, but they think it's within the normative range. So the question becomes, why do they think it's normal? It's not about, that's not an individual failing. That's a systemic failing. What does it mean to be normal? So I do think that if we, this is one of the things about messaging, Seán. When I came up with the idea of calling, you know, literally saying violence against women is a men's issue, I'll go to my grave, you know, with that phrase. You know what I mean? Because you need simple but powerful messaging. Because the vast majority of people in the world are not going to take seminars. They're not going to go to university and read books on this subject and engage with these, you know, brilliant ideas that people have been developing for decades. They're going to hear slogans. They're going to participate in social media if we're talking about the generational shift towards digital spaces. And you need really concise and accurate but powerful ways of framing the issues. And violence against women as a men's issue is, I think, one of them. Because it begins a conversation, and people will say, "Well, what does that mean? It's a men's issue?" And I'll say, "Well, for example, why do we call rape a women's issue when men are like 99% or 98%, whatever, of the perpetrators? Why do we call it a women's issue when men are the ones doing it? And by the way, men aren't the only ones. Not only are men the ones doing it, men are also experiencing it. I mean." In the military, the U.S. military, for example, which has a big, as other militaries do, sexual assault problem, a very significant percentage of the victims of sexual violence in the U.S. military are men. The military is a male-dominated space, so the real numbers are much higher for men. But the victims and the survivors of sexual violence, there's lots and lots of men. It's a much higher percentage than people think. I'm not sure if it's 30% or 40%. It's not 2%. It's not 5%. But men are the primary perpetrators of the overwhelming majority of that. So if we care about men as victims, if we care about men as survivors of sexual violence, yes, there are women who perpetrate sexual abuse against boys and young men. But let's be honest, the majority, in fact, the vast majority of boys and young men who are the victims of sexual violence are the victims of other men's sexual violence. So isn't that a self-interest issue? Like if you're a man or you care about men or young men or boys, or you feel a responsibility as an adult man to the next generation of boys and young men, shouldn't you be speaking out on this subject? And shouldn't you be partnering with women who have been at this a lot longer than men have? Instead of seeing them as, I guess it keeps saying, as our antagonists, can't you see them as our partners in this work? Isn't it obvious? And by the way, look at the sexual abuse scandal in the Catholic Church, which is obviously a huge, huge issue in Ireland. The epicenter and the beginning of the global scandal of the Catholic Church sexual abuse is Boston, my home city. And it was like so familiar to me and so familiar to so many people that I knew, because there was always this subtext. And it was, I mean, I'm not saying that everybody was aware of what was happening, but there was always this subtext that there's lines being crossed, but nobody talked about it, right? And then when it exploded, it became a global phenomenon very quickly. And then it moved from the Catholic Church into all these other institutions, whether it was religious institutions, the Boy Scouts of America, sporting organizations. There's a lot that we have to answer for, those of us who are men and who are participating in patriarchal institutions. And instead of being so defensive, look at the politics of my country right now. So much of what's happening is this defensive reaction against honest, disclosures about the reality of our history and our present, whether it's racism or sexism or heterosexism. And there's a certain percentage of the population who just don't want to hear any of this. They don't want to talk about it. They want to live in this bubble of delusion where they think everything's been great and you just need to get on board. And if you're making critical comments, then you hate this country and you should either shut up or leave.
Yeah, but why would you want to be a turkey voting for Christmas? You know, that's the reality of it. You know, so people don't want to let go of their privilege or their sense of privilege in some senses around that. I think that they're critical things when people talk about change or understanding a change.
It's true, but I think it's a very narrow understanding, because I think what that's covering up is all the trauma, because some of the same people, for example, some of the same men who will show up, you know, with an AR-15 on their shoulder saying, I'm defending this country. You know, they'll show up at a state house at a political rally with a gun and dressed in camouflage. By the way, dressed in camouflage in an urban center, which doesn't camouflage you, it calls attention to you, because it's about performing. I'm a man who's going to defend my country through violence if necessary. A lot of that, if you look at the life history of some of these guys, they would be, it's probably filled with trauma. It's probably filled with bad relationships and really narrow understandings. It's filled with self-medication, like guys drinking and guys drugging, and we have this opioid addiction crisis in the United States. We have alcoholism, as you do, where men are self-medicating. But those same men, instead of saying, you know what, I need to just take a deep breath, or I need to go into therapy, maybe I need to listen to women
or ask for help.
Yeah. Ask for help, right? Instead, it's like, I'm a man and I don't need that help. And I'm actually, the help that I need is I need to help prevent this country from going to hell. And I'm going to use violence. It's like, it's the most predictable, caricatured way of thinking about masculine strength. And I mean, many of us see right through it. It's like the trauma, like at a Trump rally, it's like so obvious that so much. I mean, I agree. Some of it is not wanting to give up privilege. And I totally agree with that. And I'm not naive about that. But it's also, and cultural centrality, because I think a lot of these men feel like, to the extent that we lift up women and people of color and the LGBTQ spectrum, those men who are white men are going to have less of the center stage. And I think they resent that, because in part they're looking at the past and they're saying, why isn't it like this? It wasn't like this for my fathers and grandfathers. Why do I have to deal with all this? Why can't I be the breadwinner, the man on stage, the man whose emotional needs come first? I mean, look at the men who are abusive in relationships. A big part of it is a belief system, as you know, which my needs should be taken care of. And if she's not taking care of those needs, I'm going to make her do that.
Yeah.
And
I can demand it. Yeah.
Yes, but why would you even believe that? Why would you even be there in that position unless you believed that men should have their emotional needs taken care of first? Which is in direct tension with the whole notion of democracy and fairness. And so a lot of men will say they believe in democracy and fairness, and you say, okay, well, what's different about anything that I've said that for basic democratic theory? It's like everybody should have a right to live a life free from violence, harassment, and abuse. Everybody should have equal opportunity to the bounties of our societies and our civilization. And if they're not getting it, then there's something wrong. And the fact that they're trying to demand it for themselves is perfectly legitimate. And by the way, I think we need to do better, Seán, much better. I think those of us who are men, and especially white men, I think what we need to do much better is create a narrative that includes men, and especially white men in this case, in the positive story about our society in the present and future, acknowledging that the past is filled with illegitimate privilege and abuse, and to this day. But how do we, because men aren't going to just shrink up and go away. I mean, they're not going away. And look at the Sweden Democrats, for God's sake. Just a few days ago, got almost 20% of the vote in the Swedish parliament, and they're a neo-Nazi party. Men and white men are not going to go away quietly, okay? And so how do we create a positive way that we can say to white men in particular, again, not exclusively, yes, you are a person who matters, and we're going to bring you in, and we're going to figure out how you can be part of the changes in a constructive way moving forward. Because if we don't have that narrative, the right has open arms for those men. The fascist movements around the world have open arms for those men, and we have to give them a better story and a better welcome.
I think we do, and as well when you look at the other aspects that are interfering with that, in terms of just say economic downturns, lack of jobs, blah blah blah. You put all that together, and it creates the real fertile conditions to create those, to run those men into the arms of that far right kind of, or that kind of space. I'm just really conscious of the time, Jackson.
Yeah.
And I want the I'm gonna wrap it there, because I really think what you to pose that question, how do we do that? I think it's something that we should all think about and go away with as a final thought in terms of today. So I'm just going to say thank you so much. I have to say, I really admire the fact that 40 years on, that the passion, the enthusiasm, and the creativity and innovation still burns so brightly in you, and it really does. I feel it every time I hear you talk or being in your company, the ones that I have been. So I really want to say thank you very much for your time today. Thank you very much for your activism and your work in academia. It's a challenge to us all to live up to such high standards. So thank you again, and I hope to see you again in the not too distant future.
Thank you so much, Seán, and back at you. I appreciate this very much. I appreciate your leadership and work, and it's good to work with you, and hopefully we'll do it again, in person or not. We'll do it. So thank you very much.
Okay, cheers. Okay.
Yeah, cheers.